Well, great. It's 11 o'clock. So with that, we can get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ryan Letourneau, co-founder, CEO at Grain Ecosystem. Grain Ecosystem was a company started to help accelerate impactful carbon removal solutions. And part of that is the story and the community that we're going to talk about today. So welcome to our webinar, From Dirt to Dollars, Unearthing the Science of Sustainable Investment. It's a pleasure to have you all here today, where we're going to focus on three key themes that support our webinar: community, carbon, and capital. We have a great agenda ahead of us today, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started by sharing my screen so you can see who you're going to hear from. I will kick us off today. My name is Ryan. I have an MBA from IE Brown and a graduate certificate in finance from Harvard University. I've been focused on supply chain, finance, and digital transformation for a majority of my career, and so really excited to get you started today to talk a little bit about community. Then we'll have Alicia. She has a bachelor's degree of science and environmental science from the University of Chicago, a master's degree in greenhouse gas accounting and management, and has been in the carbon space for over 10 years doing all kinds of carbon projects. Then Jason will share with us the topic of capital. He is the co-founder and CCO of Grain. He's an international business professional working previously with the private-backed equity Alpha Structure, working on the Terminal 1 JFK, the largest microgrid that company has done. He holds an MBA from Georgetown University and a bachelor's degree in international business from Bryant University. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to share today, kick us off, about community, the building blocks of biochar project finance. And when we talk about community and investors in that community, there are five main buckets that we like to consider. There's equity finance, carbon removal credit pre-purchase, junior debt, bank loans, and grants. We have many of you here today that see yourselves in one of those buckets, but new folks are finding this market continuously. And so if for some reason you don't see yourself in those five areas, we'd love to talk about it. We'd love to hear more from you. But just to talk very briefly about these different areas, equity finance is traditional equity. It's something that we've known. It's a percentage of ownership for an investment in a company. Carbon removal, pre-purchase, this is either a streaming agreement or a right to the carbon credits as part of that investment. Junior debt, it's a traditional debt, like a bank loan, but of a secondary position to that bank loan. Bank loans are things like your mortgage and other SBA loans that you might be familiar with, and grants. Now, each one of these gets a little bit more specific in the roles in which those stakeholders play to make sure that the incentives are aligned. When we talk about equity financing, traditionally we see three main buckets that folks will fit into. Philanthropic capital, where it's often given as a promise to either be paid back or to have a small return on that capital over time so you can keep that philanthropic mission and vision alive. Private equity capital, where you're looking for a more stable return. So the returns aren't super high, but you still want a return, one that your LPs and investors are relying on you for. Venture capital, we're looking for what we call venture returns, which is the hockey stick return, those 5x, 10x, unicorn type companies. That's what the venture capital folks are looking for. And so this is important to know, especially when you're a project developer and when you're a capital allocator, to make sure that your incentives are aligned with those projects in the community which you're investing in. Then we talk about pre-purchase. These are the three key pre-purchase models that we see in the market today. We see direct to business, credit sales through partners, credit streaming agreements. And so here, when we talk about direct to business, this is often a discount to market prices. A lot of the agreements we see today announced through companies like Microsoft or Stripe or the Frontier Fund are in this direct to business model. Credit sales through partners. One example of this is JECA. They'll oftentimes sell credit sales through themselves on behalf of the project developer to third parties to help facilitate and make that easier. And then the third piece, credit streaming agreements. A company like Carbon Streaming Corporation facilitates these agreements, where they'll invest in the project for the right to sell the credits to a third party who are already interested in purchasing those credits from them. Each of these have their benefits and downsides, but it's all about what's the best fit and the alignment of incentives of the different stakeholders that are involved in that transaction. Junior debt, it's generally uncommon in these types of models. We have seen it previously as a combination with some pre-purchase type agreements. However, it's generally uncommon as the return is not as high, and the risk, because it's secondary position to the bank loans, is just difficult to swallow. Then when we talk about bank loans, these are the most common types that we see, especially when we're talking about pyrolysis and biochar facilities. USDA Rural Development Loans, USDA Business and Industry, and Small Business Administration loans. There are other types of loans available out there, but these are the most common ones that we often see. Grants, these are simply things that you don't need to pay back. But it doesn't mean there's not an interested party that's giving you that capital. These parties that facilitate these grants and grant it as money that doesn't need to be paid back have an interest in making sure that you're successful and you're continuing the mission of that organization. Some of the key resources that do give out grants are U.S. Forestry Service. You can go to Open Grants to actually look for other types of grants, grants.gov, SBIR, and a few others. But what's really important here, the overarching message, is that while you may sit in one of those categories, or if you're building a new category, it takes community to get these projects built. It's not one type of capital that makes it all happen. One pre-purchase from a large organization, that's great, but there's still other capital that needs to come into the stack. And so what we like to talk about as GRAIN is that it's the right mix of capital and the right mix of cost of capital that ensures there's an alignment of incentives and that you have a fully funded project. Here's two examples, scenario A and scenario B, that we often like to refer to when we talk about projects that are successful. First is a project structure where bank loans take up 80% of the capital, and then the remaining 20% of the capital is a mix between equity financing and carbon removal credit pre-purchases. With this mixed together, you reach 100% of that financing. But what's important here is you are mixing that financing. So you have equity financing, which you're giving away a percentage of the company or the SPV, which you've created. You have carbon removal credit pre-purchase, which is you're giving away part of the credits or all of the credits in return for capital up front, and bank loans, which is structured traditionally like a mortgage or another bank loan, which you may be involved with, in which there's a requirement of actual liquid capital in order to secure those loans. Scenario B, you have grants, which is, as I mentioned, money that you get oftentimes with a promise. So either if you raise the money, you get it as a matching fund, or that you need to deliver on specific milestones and reporting elements in order to keep that grant and not have to repay it. And so as part of this grant, it's 50% grant and then 50% matching funds. You still have a bank loan, while smaller. You are able to capture that bank loan, and then equity financing for a small 10% of the stack. The grants will match the remaining 50%, and you're off to the races to begin building your project. With that in mind, I'm going to turn it over now to Alicia to tell you a little bit more about carbon and the value that carbon brings to these projects, and why investors are interested in investing in these projects, and how you can capture some value by participating in this sphere. Alicia, over to you.
Thanks, Ryan. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and jump in. All right, so thank you for the lovely introduction already, Ryan. My name is Alicia Klepfer. I am our carbon expert at GRAIN. As Ryan mentioned, I have my master's in greenhouse gas accounting and management, and I've been in this space for 10 plus years in carbon and climate action. And the majority of my career has been dedicated to making sure that carbon projects are high quality, efficient, scalable, defensible, all those good things that we want them to be. So just to do some quick level setting, make sure we're all sort of on the same page about why we're talking about this and why we care. So obviously carbon is, kind of a buzzword these days. And why do we talk about it? Mainly because it's a way to measure climate impact. So obviously not all greenhouse gases are carbon-based. The most common ones are CO2 and CH4 methane, but then there's nitrous oxide and others that are not carbon-based. However, we've kind of decided collectively as an industry that the common metric will be tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's how we get with this carbon term as a buzzword for basically greenhouse gases in general. And when we talk about carbon, the biggest reason that we're using that as well is that it becomes a financial instrument. So since you can't touch or see carbon dioxide, it's harder to measure. And so with carbon and TCO2e, it becomes this financial instrument that can enable markets and incentivize action that otherwise probably wouldn't be there, hopefully would, but probably wouldn't be. In terms of the how, so GRAIN specifically works in the voluntary carbon market. as opposed to the regulatory or compliance market, such as in many other countries like Canada or in the state of California. Those are examples of regulatory and compliance markets. In places where there is no regulatory or compliance market, obviously there's people still want to participate, which is why we have the voluntary carbon market. And we specifically work in carbon removals. So that is removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, as opposed to obviously avoidance or reduction projects that are working on avoiding emitting those gases in the first place. And so the two kind of typical project types under the voluntary carbon market are going to be offsetting and insetting. And offsetting, as you probably well know, is when groups develop projects, are removing or avoiding greenhouse gases, are then certifying those projects and then sell them to another party so that the other party can make the claim and say that they reduced emissions by purchasing those offsets. And then insetting, a bit different, is where companies specifically are looking at their Scope 3 emissions. So these are emissions that happen along their supply chain but aren't directly tied to them because technically they're in Scope 1 of another company. But obviously it's kind of the end product is where the financial instrument is happening. So it's up to these Scope 3 companies to make the initiative and be reducing emissions in their supply chain. A good example of this is Nespresso. Many other food and beverage companies are starting to take action or have been taking action. And so they're, reducing emissions that are either upstream or downstream from their direct facility. And so one of the things that we like to talk about is like why we have standards. So if we did not have any of these voluntary carbon market standards, then pretty much anyone could make a claim. That means there would be no legitimacy necessarily, no accuracy maybe, we wouldn't know. And potentially there would be kind of a threat to this whole climate industry. As I'm sure you've seen in the press, like people like to kind of throw shade on the things that are public and active. And so if we are using these registries, we know that the backstops are in place to make sure that these are good projects and good credits at the end of the day. And so these standards, I'll get into on the next slide a few, but voluntary verified carbon standards, Climate Action Reserve, American Carbon Registry, those are some of the prime ones working in the US. And all of these have minimum standards that will discourage bad actors. So basically close loopholes so that they can't be claiming things without actually backing it up with evidence. And ensure that projects are standardized to a degree. Obviously, every project is different, but they make it so that you have to meet this bare minimum of requirements in order to move forward. And all this information is supposed to be transparent, obviously, so that public reviews and analysis can occur and make sure that their backstops are working, and that there's enough scrutiny on the industry to make sure we're all trying to get better and trying to improve. And then on top of these general rules that these standards have, there are also activity-specific methodologies. So these will give more comprehensive and customized rules for a specific action or intervention that's happening. So in this scenario, what that means is we're talking about biochar. So as I mentioned, grain works specifically in the removal space, and biochar is what we call an engineered removal. So it's different from a nature-based solution like forestry or soil sequestration in grasslands. And so as I mentioned, lots of standards have a whole lot of methodologies for a whole lot of things, but only 3 standards right now have a biochar methodology, which are the Verified Carbon Standard, Climate Action Reserve, Biochar Protocol, and Puro.Earth biochar methodology. And so at the end of the day, what the heck is biochar? This is another one that I'm sure you've heard the word tossed around. So biochar is similar to charcoal. In essence, you can think of it that way. But it's where you take biogenic materials or organic materials, but not like organic like food labels, but organic as opposed to inorganic. So biogenic materials are anything that grows like a plant or is produced by animals. It's basically living things. So manure, grass, wood, algae, all good examples of biogenic materials. And they're essentially cooked, if you will. They're heated at high temperatures in an oxygen limited environment so that it's not oxidizing all of it. Excuse me. And so basically cooking the material, creates these really stable carbon structures that won't be broken down by microbes, that won't decay naturally in any short period of time. And then essentially, so that carbon is sequestered or captured in that biochar. And that is what we can generate carbon credits from. And so in terms of carbon credits, how do we calculate carbon credits? It's kind of a complicated thing, so I'm going to boil it down to this really simple list. Like I said, there are whole methodologies. The CAR one is like 75 pages, so there's a lot that goes into it. But at a high level, these methodologies or protocols are providing equations to calculate total credits and provide rules and guidelines around what data and evidence you need to collect in order to pass the verification and get your credits serialized or certified. So some of the variables that do go into carbon biochar accounting, the biggest one usually is permanence. Permanence is how much of that carbon will persist over kind of an arbitrary 100-year period. So we call that the 100-year permanence period. And many research articles are coming out saying that biochar persists long beyond that. But the methodologies are conservative, obviously, because they don't want to be overstating your climate impact. And so most methodologies have a default value that is lower than what research would suggest. As more research is coming out, the uncertainty is going down, and so they're reassessing the methodology when they do their edits and new versions. They're including that new information every time. So in other words, it's expected that the permanence value may go up in the future. The carbon content of the biochar, so obviously that's a big one. How much of, when you end up with 100 tons of biochar, how much of that is actually carbon? It's quite a wide range depending on the feedstock biomass that you're using to actually create that biochar. So we've seen as low as 40% and as high as 92% carbon. So it can be a very carbon dense material. And then the next metric to go along with that is the hydrogen to organic carbon ratio. So this is a metric of how stable the carbon is because the carbon is bound to the hydrogen atoms. And again, that makes it so the lower your H2C ratio is, the less able microbes are able to eat it. I was on a webinar the other day and they said, you can't eat a plate. And so that was his analogy for when carbon has a very low H2C ratio, it becomes, instead of like a jelly sandwich, it becomes a plate and you can't eat the plate. And then a few other things, just like I said, the list is long. I just wanted to give you a taste of some of the things that go into it. But the amount of biochar produced, so again, what's the total volume or weight, the temperature of the process, which also plays into the H2C ratio, the process type in terms of how much oxygen you're letting in or not, moisture content of the final biochar, because you can't get credits for the water that's in your biochar, so we have to subtract that out. Transportation distances for any emitted greenhouse gases that you subtract from your final number, et cetera, et cetera. And what do we actually do with biochar? Obviously, that's all well and good that it has a bunch of carbon in it. Technically speaking, once you have cooked your material, that biochar, your carbon is sequestered. The issue, however, becomes that if you burn it, so if you light it on fire, it's like charcoal, it's going to burn. It's a very good burning feedstock, if you will. And so all of the methodologies have incentives in place, or not incentives, but rules in place that say you can't burn it. That would then become like a biofuels project or something similar, where then it's no longer a reversal, it's no longer a removal, and then it's becoming like clean energy and avoidance project. So instead, what we like to do is you can apply it to many different uses. So soil application is the big one, where not only can you put it back in the soil, it very much can help those soils, specifically in degraded lands. There are huge improvements to yields and productivity once you apply biochar back into the soil. I included a couple references there, but there are many, many papers that show how well it works to improve soils. And then as well as an addition to concrete, asphalt, it can be used in water filtration. You can put it in animal feed. Like there are a lot of different uses, not all of which will be eligible for methodologies, simply because we don't have the data or the evidence that says it isn't, by going through that process, it isn't degrading and releasing some carbon. Again, as research comes out, that will be updated. So regarding the burning of it, that would be considered a reversal, where you said that you had this sequestered carbon and now you burn it and now it's basically all released back to the atmosphere. That is something that it's a very low risk, because it would have to be pretty intentional that you are going and actively burning your biochar. Usually that doesn't happen, and there are things in place in the methodologies, for instance, that say when you're applying it to soils, if you just surface apply it, then that's not an eligible end use, because what if a wildfire sweeps through? Then that could still be burned and your carbon would no longer be sequestered. So instead, they have you mix it with compost if you want to surface apply, or if you want to do subsurface, you can till it into the soil and mix it all up. Those make it so that it's very unlikely that the biochar will burn, because it's no longer a pure feedstock. And so there's a very low risk of reversal, is what we say, which, again, unlike nature-based solutions, where nature-based solutions, there's a lot of accidental reversal that can happen. So if a forest burns down, if you till your soil, if you drill your wetlands, whatever it is, those things are very different from biochar, where there's no kind of accidental things that should happen. And at the end of the day, biochar and biochar credits are durable, defensible, and robust. I've worked personally in a lot of different project types, both removals and avoidance, and gotten those projects through verification. So grasslands, rangelands, annual cropping systems, nitrogen reduction, oil and gas, solar, et cetera, et cetera. And many of them have a lot of challenges. And although they're great, like I said, there are so many methodologies out there for very specific use cases. For avoidance projects, many of those, if it's energy-based or similar, those are quickly becoming regulated. So the opportunities are getting smaller. This has already happened, like solar projects are no longer credited in the US. And oil and gas projects are becoming more and more regulated. And so that's on the avoidance side. It's getting harder to find good opportunities, or they just have technical challenges because it's complicated technology that we're trying to use to avoid emitting. Versus removals, for removal projects, generally those have practical challenges. So as we were talking about with nature-based solutions, they have very long monitoring periods. So you have to monitor your forest for 100 years to make sure that it doesn't go up in flames. And you're also relying on natural timescales. So you are dependent on the time it takes for that tree to grow. So biochar, we have found, is quite a happy medium, what we call an engineered removal, because it doesn't have the regulatory risk necessarily like some other energy projects. And we're not waiting on natural timescales like you are with a nature-based solution. And so grain, like I mentioned, is specifically focused on removals and specifically engineered removals right now. We will soon be moving to other ones, such as enhanced rock weathering. And our intent is to keep focused in this area of removals and see what other methodologies we can cover. And so just some quick metrics. So I wanted to give some idea of the scope and size of the opportunity, where specifically we're talking about turning waste into value, turning it into biochar. And so EPA statistic is that the US had 184 million short tons, US tons of biogenic waste in the US in 2018. That converts to 166 million metric tons. And then we would apply like a 30% yield. So of all this material you would be turning into biochar, after you cook it down, it shrinks down to only 30%. We're going to put a general number in here of 70% carbon content in the biochar. And we're going to use 0.89 permanence factor, which means it's been cooked at a very high temperature and the HC ratio is very low. And then there's a conversion factor between taking it from carbon and turning it to that TCO2e. And at the end of the day, that equates to 114 million TCO2e, so credits per year potential at this waste level. So the average biochar credit price was quoted at $179 in 2022. So when you take those those credits per year and you multiply them by $179, you're getting $20 billion. That is the scope of what we could be doing with all of this waste that is currently going to landfills or just decaying out in the open. And obviously $179 can be kind of high. We don't necessarily know that it will stay that high. So even if we put it at a more conservative price of $100 per ton, that's still $11 billion per year from the credits alone. So that doesn't even include the price of selling the biochar to farmers, to concrete producers, etc. Those are all my slides. I know I went pretty fast. Feel free to ask questions in the Q&A or, shoot Grain a message and we're happy to jump on a call with you. And I'd like to introduce Jason, and he is going to speak next.
Just getting my camera here. Hopefully I'm clicking on the camera. Not sure why the camera's not working. Just bear with me a second. There we go.
Okay.
Apologies about that, everybody. Sometimes it gets a little tricky on the train tracks. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Ryan. Fantastic tee up. And really, first of all, it's great to be back on a webinar. I never thought I would say that, but with all of the conferences and excitement that's happening in the field, it's nice to take a step back, sit down, put down and discuss thoughts and reconnect with colleagues, acquaintances, and folks in the industry all around the world. And I looked at the attendee list. There's folks literally joining from all over the world. So it is great to have you here. Alicia, I don't know if you knew it when you teed it up with the plate analogy, but I was thinking as you were talking, a plate itself is not sustenance. It's really the canvas for a meal. And that's kind of the role that grain plays in terms of providing that canvas, depending on the different types of feedstock that you have, moisture content, a lot of the elements that Alicia talked about, and then the end use application. And I'm going to walk through a little bit momentarily about the things grain does to support with those different key elements. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully that goes a lot smoother than my camera. So we should be good to go there. So what I'm going to do is take you through a journey and really set the table, as I've said multiple times in the past, in terms of art of the possible. And I will try to breeze through this in a timely fashion because I already see a bunch of questions coming into the chat. And it's really, this webinar is about all of you and making sure we're addressing your questions both here in this forum and then subsequently as we continue to go about our day-to-day lives and work on solving these complex waste to value solutions and problems. So today, when you look at grain, you think about what does grain do? So at the beginning of our process, and you'll see it on our website, anybody can go on and test against eligibility. So Alicia talked a little bit about carbon markets, the role of the different methodology, standards, bodies, and calculations. How do we demystify that? So the whole goal is to demystify, less reporting, more doing, and make it easy to go tell the economic story to bridge the gap between the theoretical and the technical and actually getting the injection of capital and deploying a project. And a couple of things that we're really excited about as part of the platform is first and foremost our equipment matching functionality. I think one thing we've all learned, particularly over the last couple of years, a lot of projects have many of the core elements, but they're lacking some of the key pieces around what is the best technology, or they pick the technology that doesn't align with their geography, feedstock type, moisture content, and certainly the economics of the project, the inputs, the throughputs, etc. So Grain has been really proud to roll out an equipment matching tool to help ensure you're picking the right type of gasification or pyrolysis unit for your project. And we've also rolled out our education or knowledge hub. And this is really a place where you can come to get sound guidance and information. For example, as Ryan mentioned earlier, we have really unique and tactical partnerships with groups like JECA, Ariel Green on the technology insurance wrapper side. And there's loads of other critical information, particularly also what to do with your carbon credits. how to think about spot pricing and forward contracts, and more broadly, the key facts and questions and terminologies that come up in the industry that many of us who are so deep in the weeds, like our friends at the US Biochar Institute and IBI, coming together to make it simplified and easy. So you can test the eligibility checker seamlessly today. And these are some of the elements that you will look to engage with and take advantage of as part of the Grain platform. And again, as Alicia mentioned, the goal is, and this is the beauty of being agnostic, giving you the opportunity to test in an unlimited capacity against the different standards bodies and form factors. So Vera, Puro, Climate Action Reserve. And it's really straightforward and simplistic. I mean, our goal with Grain was, how do we make this simple? How do we help you rapidly and swiftly to understand if your project is eligible? And I'll tell you, I mean, we've looked at hundreds of projects all around the world, and many projects were moving forward or allocating time and money, and they weren't actually eligible for a methodology. So that's part of it. So this ranges from the base questions of what kind of biochar generation, are you going to put a health and safety plan? We've embedded, with the help of our carbon experts, different wikis across the platform to try to make it as low of a lift and low stress as possible for you to ease your way through the platform to understand eligibility and be sure you're ready to answer questions based on where you are in the process. And it's okay to tack, it's okay to reverse. That's the whole point of this thing, to make sure that we're putting you in the best position to be successful. And you can see here, once you go through the eligibility piece, you find out you are eligible. Grain will then deliver you the appropriate documentation to help streamline with that registry or standards body. And then from there, we go into the quantification piece. So Alicia did a really nice job of painting a picture of something that is not that simple to understand what is the carbon profile of the project. This process typically can take anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour, depending on how prepared you are. There are different elements throughout the process where you'll have to upload information. So you can see here, you've got equipment yields. So you start this process once you've gone through the equipment matching tool and you've selected an equipment that you're going to use in the process. And then you're basically, again, filling out critical information. So specifications documents. Are your units mobile or not mobile? Looking at the dry weights of the biochar and the feedstock. And what happens at the end of this section is we're deriving an output. And the output essentially shows the carbon content of the biochar, the emissions profile from pre-processing, processing, post-processing, and then ultimately how many credits per annum is your project essentially eligible for based on these input variables. And this is really important because now you're preparing yourself to go speak to investors, and you can actually defend the numbers and showcase why. That's why even if a project has done some of this work up front, from an integrity perspective and at the bequest of the investors that are in the Grain ecosystem, we like to make sure that this exercise is still taken to ensure that there's a level of confidence, and it gives the carbon experts on our team like Alicia a chance to challenge and ensure the integrity of the inputs and the outputs in the process. And you can see, again, what this looks like. This is why it's also very nice from a scope 3 perspective. Alicia mentioned Nestle. We saw our friends at Pepsi recently out in New Zealand looking at biochar. These are massive supply chains. They want to know what is the emissions profile of their scope 3 supply. And again, from here, we've captured a lot of information, and this is where we drive the art of the possible part of the story, our profitability questionnaire. And this is, as Ryan described earlier, and again, if you haven't looked at it, I would encourage you. We have a couple of blog posts that talk about carbon dioxide removal financing that Ryan authored. And this feeds into this section because there's a number of questions that we ask to ensure that you're not missing out on any optimal revenue streams for your project. And the goal here is, of course, to help you think through the biochar pricing Some of the projects on the grain platform already have offtake in place, so that's pretty straightforward. They implement the contract pricing. If not, we can give recommendations depending on some variables and certainly what you envision the offtake to be. As Alicia was saying, is it a soil amendment, water filtration, certainly hard to abate, concrete, etc. So we look at those elements. We have information ready to support you with thinking through pricing. Again, if you don't have the offtake agreements in place, we structure this information and make it easy to enter. So doing away with some of the painful Excel documentation and having to build out complex models. Grain essentially does that for you, leveraging our experience doing it. And ultimately, you can see here, we're driving towards a comprehensive pro forma that is capturing over a 7-year vintage, the different streams of revenue, whether that is the biochar, the offsets, the bio oil, wood vinegar. Are there power purchase agreements tied to your project? Is there a waste to energy potential? And this is the benefit where a lot of us come from the world of financing, energy as a service, and renewable projects. So taking a lot of our experience there and applying it to this concept. And you can see we leave no stone unturned, which is really important. A lot of projects actually, to what Ryan was alluding to earlier, miss some of the key elements on the OpEx side, the equipment side, and that also includes the carbon expenses as well. We account for that in the model. We have a very good feel of what those expenses look like. And then the goal is to help you calculate the IRR and the NPV and really drive towards a comprehensive, high-level document that is defensible, and it makes it easy for you to present your project opportunity to all of the investor profiles that Ryan highlighted at the beginning of the presentation. And this is really critical because you have to know how much money your project is going to need for phase one. What is the plan if you are scaling? And a lot of our investors like to see projects that have scale potential. And then how much money do you actually need today? And to do that, we help you articulate the value proposition. We tend to ring fence to the best of our ability, the feedstock, the technology readiness. Certainly that's big. A lot of investors like to see TRL level 6 or higher. Certainly eligibility, as Alicia talked about earlier, what methodology are you using? Certainly there's methodologies that have higher awareness levels than others amongst our investor community. And our job at Grain is to help educate and bring down the barriers to comprehend what those methodologies mean. And then you've got offset, offtake, contracts in place. So what does that look like? Ryan mentioned some names at the beginning of companies that we work with there. And then execution risk, very important. I see this too many times where the EPC, the engineering, procurement, construction piece is not well put together. This is really, really pivotal. It can lead to major cost overruns, huge time issues, and then it can inhibit your ability to close with the bank or with your financial partners, especially if it's a USDA-backed loan, an incentive, a wood innovation grant, some state and local money, etc. So it's really important to have this all buttoned up. And again, this is where Grain thrives and has serious expertise and capabilities. And again, we work with you. It's all about optimizing cost of capital. So we work with you to think through what commercial structures are best for your business. Obviously, you want to maximize non-dilutive capital at all costs. And these are all the things we think through before we go to our investor view, which I'm going to breeze through here momentarily. But I thought it was very important to unpack what you go through on the platform. Once this is stamped and we feel confident with the integrity of the numbers and the revenue streams, it is then fed to our Grain investor developer view. And for all of the investors on the call today, and I see a number of names that I recognize, it's very simple and straightforward. You would come on this platform, you would create an account, highlight the capital available or that you're looking to deploy as part of your fund or as part of your family office network or philanthropic catalytic capital. You would highlight your preferred investment structure. So all of the things that, again, Ryan mentioned at the beginning of the talk. And this is really important because when you are reaching out to developers on the platform, they are going to want to know who you are, how you invest and ensure that there is alignment with them and with you. So you're setting the tone essentially. So it's important to have a really good profile, just like you would on LinkedIn or any other professional platform. You're going to see projects in a form factor like this. So with Grain, we talk to all of our investors. We try to have a good understanding of what their investment thesis is, what geographies they invest in, and other critical pieces of information, so we can ensure right-sized projects are being fed into their custom investor view. Projects will look like this. So an investor can see where the project is, NPV, IRR, investment needed, etc. The investor can then select to check the details of the project. I'll make this a little bit bigger here. And from there, you will get to drill in, learn a little bit more about the team and the company. Again, always flagging the main outputs. What's the net emission reduction per annum? Biochar production, NPV and IRR. How are they looking to raise money? So what do they have planned versus secured? So you can start to prepare and think about how you would want to engage with that developer. We look at the timelines, which is really critical. So when are you, from the moment capital is injected and a down payment is put on the equipment, when are you actually going to be sequestering carbon? So doing the end use application and sequestering carbon. You've got the different status elements here. And then if you're interested in the project, you notify the developer. They would accept you on the platform. And then from there, you would get access to the carbon project details. So again, very clear, streamlined, easy to follow what that looks like with the associated lab tests, all of the equipment information, a very detailed and comprehensive and easy to follow financial pro forma, and then the data room. And this is really important because what we've done with the data room has been very meticulous in ensuring it's got everything that the investors that we've worked with want to see to make a decision, because the goal of Grain is to accelerate sequestration and allocation of capital. How do we get to LOIs and term sheets fast? And we do that by being very cognizant and aware of what investors need. And the nice thing for our investors is they can then communicate directly with the project developers to ensure if there's something missing in that data room or something that they need to quickly do their diligence process, they can then do that, which is fantastic. It prevents a lot of headache, certainly gives some good relief, and it allows us to really move the chains in a comprehensive manner. And you can see these are some of the things that are considered and included in the data room. Everything from the register, we've got different purchase agreements, subsidiary information, obviously all the key things about the company. Those are obviously vital to advancing the change and moving the process forward. So I with that said, before I go into the Q&A questions, and we have a bunch of them, so I want to make sure I meticulously get through them and address them to the right people. For further inquiries, a couple of things. You'll see a QR code here. You can scan this QR code. It's going to get you over to the platform. If you're an investor, you can create your investor account and start engaging with Grain today and our amazing project developers all over the world. If you are a developer, you can also create an account, start doing the feasibility eligibility checker against the different methodologies. And then obviously, if you're eligible, we can start to lean in and talk about how we can support your project. And if you're not eligible, same thing. We can have discussions there. Obviously, you can also reach out to jack@grainecosystem.com for the project developers if you're looking to engage and get started. So with that, I am going to now go into the Q&A session. I am going to stop. I will keep this up for a couple more minutes. But the first question that we have, Ryan, it's for you. And if I'm reading it correctly, it's from a project developer. I have already done a high-level carbon analysis, but desperately need support in building out a business case to get access to the right sources of capital. How would I start with Grain, as our scenario is a bit non-traditional based on what I've seen?
Yeah, great question, and thanks for asking. Um, when you're thinking about interacting with grain, what Jason shared and where we start at the story is really at the beginning. So you may have some feedstock, you don't know how it's going to stack up in terms of carbon content. However, there are a lot of project developers we work with that have already done their tests or their high-level LCAs. And what's magic about the platform and the way it's built is you can start with high-level estimates and defaults in the market, or you can input the information that comes directly from your lab tests or your LCAs that you've already had done. And so through that process, we're able to get a more accurate estimate of exactly what is special for your project. That's the first part of the story. It doesn't matter how far along you are, you can still use the Grain platform. The second part of the story, when it comes to capital allocation, that's a conversation that we have about the options and what's available in the world of capital. As you'll remember, we talked about the 5 different buckets. Within that bucket, there's several other categories, and we have different investors that are playing different roles there. So it's a conversation. You can have some ideas coming into it about what you're thinking, what you'd like to have, and the focus there is really for us to ask why and to challenge that allocation to make sure you're getting the most optimal cost of capital. So wherever you're at in that story, there's a way to work with Grain, and we're here to make sure that your project is successful and that you're well on your way to being best positioned to get capital into that project.
Thank you for that, Ryan. Very, very clear. And hopefully, person who asked that question, feel free if you have any other follow-ups. This next one is a longer one. I'm going to try to synthesize it. It looks like it's for you, Alicia. Great presentation, Alicia. Question on the methodology. So essentially, they're asking, why are most biochar carbon credit projects Puro.Earth? And what are the pros and cons of the different methodologies, both present and forthcoming?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. So I think first to answer the first bit, why are most carbon credits for Puro.Earth projects? A lot of that I think was simply that Puro was the first biochar methodology that came out on a what we call standardized, I don't know what the word we want to use is, but so there are some registries that are endorsed by the ICVCM. So in other words, like quality boards and initiatives that are saying, okay, these certain registries meet these specific requirements, these minimum requirements to make sure that it's a good one. And so Puro was the first of those to be live on the market. So that certainly played into it, as well as I think this answers your second part of your question as well in terms of pros and cons of the different methodologies. All of them kind of speak to the same requirements in terms of feedstock, in terms of permanence, in terms of processing. But all of them do it in a little bit of a different way. So it really depends on what you have the capacity or the interest in doing. So for instance, Puro just does an LCA. So that means, and an LCA is a life cycle assessment. Those are usually done by like a third party consultant who comes in and reviews your whole project and says exactly here are all the emissions from all of the stages of your project, versus like Vera and CAR basically bake a simplified LCA into the methodology where there's much less guesswork. You don't need to hire a third-party consultant to do your analysis. So some people like the flexibility of being able to do an LCA, while others are like, I don't want to hire any third party right now to do this, as well as it's, less guidance if it's just go do an LCA versus here is a very prescriptive list of things you have to do and requirements. I think there are some other differences in terms of timing. So Vera has kind of more hurdles in their methodology, so it takes a little bit longer to get to verification, as well as like there are things in place that make sure that you are taking the time and doing all these things very in order and doing it well. And like I said, Puro is more of a go do your own thing and we'll verify it at the end. So it kind of depends on what you're preferring. And yeah, I think that is my most succinct answer on that. I could go on for a long time, but
I am so glad we have that. We have it recorded too, because we get that question a lot, Alicia, and I think you did a very good job in a succinct fashion of addressing it. So we need to play that one on repeat for sure. And stay right there because there's a few more for you, Alicia, which I was anticipating we would get a lot, for you because it's a really important topic and there's a lot of questions. So the next one what are the risks and requirements for sustainable feedstock? Do you see any risks in changes in what we consider sustainable in quotes?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. So the majority of the time, what we're seeing, so specifically with Vera, you can only have a waste feedstock. So it's only something that under your baseline scenario, without the project, that waste would be decaying, decomposing, it would be thrown out. There's no use for it. So that de facto means it is sustainable because you're actually putting that to a better use. So I don't see much risk with that. There can be some gray area in terms of how do you define waste, because a lot of things you can make up some end use for that you could use it for something really weird, but it's not common practice. So there would be very few cases, I think, in which a feedstock, we're pretty inventive. So I think there are, the feedstocks that could be used are already being used. So these ones that are waste are not going to go away. In terms of requirements, so the requirement side is more on what we call purpose-grown feedstocks. So those are things that if you have a field, you want to grow grass, and then you take that grass and you turn it into biochar. You are purposefully growing that crop for biochar. That has a lot more nuance to it because obviously you're potentially emitting greenhouse gases from the land. And a lot of these registries are trying to incentivize you using waste because we have so much of it. And so for sustainable feedstock of purpose-grown waste, that would only be Puro and CAR right now. CAR has some very specific requirements in terms of like you have to grow it on old lands that are like old mining lands or something where you're not using productive cropland, that then you would have leakage, what we call leakage, where potentially other cropland would have to be tilled up and used because you are replacing that other cropland. So I think purpose grown is a little bit more, and that there's a lot of debate in the industry of whether or not we should include purpose grown feedstocks. So I think if you stick with waste, there's very little risk and it's not going anywhere. Purpose grown feedstock is where the majority of the risks are, and those are harder to prove that they are quote unquote sustainable.
Perfect, Alicia. And maybe for the triple crown, and then I think I can take this other question that came up. If we're thinking about the potential return of a project, are there areas we should focus on to maximize credits issued and minimize risk of issuing less credits than planned?
Yeah, absolutely. And that, like I said, has been basically the entirety of my career, is trying to lower that risk and making sure that there are a lot of QA/QC processes embedded in your project that make sure that so in carbon accounting, if you can't be accurate, then you have to be conservative. So the goal is to be as accurate as possible, so you have the data and evidence that you can prove the value, and there's no debate about it, essentially. So in those scenarios, you would get, the maximum amount of credits, and you wouldn't have to be conservative and take a deduction. A lot of those things, it's very varied how we achieve that, though. Some of it is like we don't want to always use default factors. We certainly can. That's a good fallback. But if you know you can get better values from a lab test, let's do it. It's worth it at the end of the day because you'll get your money back. And in terms of execution risk and the way that we are setting up projects with the registries as well, like I said, we have those measures in place that we kind of push you to be better and have less risk. So at the end of the day, no one can challenge your project. You have everything buttoned up, and you'll get a maximum amount of credits.
Super clear and concise, Alicia. Thanks for that. And I think for the group, if you've got more questions, certainly for Alicia, we do have a little bit more time. I am going to take this next one here. So the question is, let me make sure I've got it right. Does Grain offer additional services after projects receive investment? So I'll answer that succinctly as possible. So as Alicia was kind of alluding to, and we looked at in the presentation, selling the credits doesn't automatically mean credits are issued. So you're obviously obligated to deliver, provide proof of work, including creation of the biochar and the application of the biochar. Is it a field? Is it cement? Is it filtration? I think there's been 55 use cases identified. And as Alicia will tell you, not all of them are eligible. And then you've got to ensure that credits are transferred and retired. So this process has heavy documentation. There's a lot of pieces, periodic intervals, and elements around moisture content and recordings. So for grain, we want to be there with you right in that process. We intend to work with our project developers, not just to help them continue to get connected to investors to scale, but also to ensure the integrity of the project and that they are fulfilling their obligations to the pre-purchasers of credits and certainly other elements that they have in place. Remember also, it's just like when you do, Ryan used the case once, and this is why 2 years ago we said we were the turbo tax of carbon offsets originally. That was our original slogan a long time ago for many of you who've been involved or followed grain for a while. And it's likened to that in an accountant. You're going to use an accountant to ensure smooth operations if you're engaging with the IRS. So having a third party is essential, and the standards require supporting documents and an audit trail with the right evidence. So if there's only an 80% acceptance of your evidence, a portion of the credits may be lost. So with grain, you can automate the document trail. We can help you ensure compliance for anything that is relevant to the key stakeholders, thus relieving that burden of proof. And as I said at the beginning, less reporting, more doing, focusing on growing your business and implementing and executing in those communities that you operate within. So hopefully for the person that asked that question, that gives good clarity. And this is something we would obviously talk with you about when you do register and engage with the grain ecosystem. We have one more question, and we have time for one more question, which is good. And I think this, Alicia, probably is best with you because I don't know it off the top of my head. Do you have a list of labs that you can recommend for the analysis of feedstock, biochar, and other elements that would go into the process?
Yeah, we do. We certainly do. We're working on an article that will be published on the platform soon. The short answer, though, is essentially a lot of labs can do this work. You can call and ask, and sometimes they're like, oh, yeah, we could do that test. Otherwise, it becomes a question of, like how far you're willing to ship your material, because there are quite a few labs on the West Coast, but obviously if you're on the East Coast, that's more difficult, but shipping usually can be overcome pretty easily. And the list we're compiling is kind of a mixture of, just labs that we've had projects use, as well as other groups like IBI and others that we know that they are routing people to those labs as well. So we do have that list. It will be public, or at least published on our platform. And yeah, I think the only one I can think of off the top of my head is Control Laboratories, but again, that's in California. So that's a place to start, though. Oh, yes, thank you. And we have someone put the USBI link to their biochar labs, so we can share that as well after.
And I do think I was scanning the attendee list. I do think John Webster from USBI is here and present, and he's just been fantastic at putting out great content. And we're honored and privileged to continue to collaborate with USBI and IBI to ensure that our developer and investor community is getting what they need at the right time. And that's vital because it's all about resource capability allocation. With that said, I've put the screen back up here for further inquiries, making it very clear, grainecosystem.com. We are very active on LinkedIn. We're always putting out relevant content. But the most important thing is, if you want to get involved in biochar, you want to scale your project opportunity, you want to seek out getting connected with the right types of investors for your project, go to grainecosystem.com, create an account, get in touch with us. We'd love to help you. We'd love to hear your stories and figure out how we can build the circular economy and resilient ecosystem that we all desperately need around the world. So with that, I will call this to a close for today. The webinar will be made available for your colleagues that were not able to join us. So we'll be sure to share that in a post-webinar recap email. Thank you so much for your time and your fantastic questions. And we will see you at a grain station soon. Take care.